Millions of tons of ammunition were expended in the land, sea, and air battles of World War II. The movement of ordnance to the combat zones posed enormous problems, not the least of which was preventing accidental detonation of ammunition during shipment and transshipment. Perhaps the greatest hazard was at the Tidewater Ammunition Depot, where large quantities of explosives were concentrated for loading aboard ship. Typical of these wartime depots was the Naval Magazine, Port Chicago, a vital military installation that was to provide the military services with valuable experience in the stowage and handling of ammunition. Here was underlined tragically the problem of protecting nearby communities from the effects of accidental explosions. The magazine's location, near two of the largest naval shipyards on the West Coast, Hunter's Point and Mare Island, together with a deep channel and moderate tides, made it ideal for loading ammunition ships, cargo ships, and barges. Within commuting distance was an open labor market in Pittsburgh, Concord, Martinez, and other towns in Contra Costa County. Connecting Port Chicago with inland depots and factories manufacturing ammunition were two transcontinental railroads and heavy-duty highways. As the war in the Pacific increased in tempo, the Port Chicago Naval Magazine became the largest and busiest on the West Coast. Each day, trains of high explosives arrived in the classification yards. Until ready for loading at the piers, they were held in sheltered revetments. Some ammunition was stowed in protected magazines, sufficiently isolated from one another and from inhabited structures to prevent large explosions and widespread damage. Here in the magazine area, safety precautions were rigidly followed at all times. Eventually, these explosives had to be brought together in large concentrations during the loading of ammunition ships, thus losing the safety inherent in the segregation of ordnance materials stowed in magazines. Frequently, the urgent need for ammunition forced the depot to load two ships at the same time at the same pier. So it was on the night of July 17, 1944. The Quinault Victory and the E.A. Bryan were moored at the Naval Magazine, Port Chicago. 16 cars of ammunition and bombs were spotted on the pier beside the Quinault Victory as the ship rigged to load. Bryan had been loading day and night for more than 3 days. 3.5 million pounds of explosives were aboard or waiting nearby on the pier. Everything was normal until 10:19. Killed 320 military, merchant marine, and civilian personnel, all working within 1,000 feet of the explosion. Injured 390, including residents of Port Chicago and people up to 12 miles away. In the vicinity of the loading piers, total destruction. Both ships, broken, twisted hulks. This is what remained of the loading piers and railroad cars. In the revetment area nearby, extensive damage from the blast and from flying fragments. In the waterfront barracks and administration area, buildings crumpled like cardboard, roofs blown off, walls gone. Fragments ranging from an 8-ton winch to large pieces of plate and shattered forgings thrown outward from the explosion, some as far as 2½ miles. Although the main street was roughly parallel to the direction of the blast wave, many commercial buildings suffered extensive merchandise and structural damage. It was fortunate that the blast occurred at night, when people were inside their homes and not exposed to the flying glass. Port Chicago's theater. Patrons attending the late show escaped before the roof caved in. The railroad station. A train arriving at the time of the blast was damaged. A passenger blinded. Throughout Port Chicago, most buildings suffered structural damage, as did the nearby community of Nichols. Arriving with disaster crews after the explosion was a Navy Board of Investigation, appointed by the Commandant, 12th Naval District. Field crews surveyed, inventoried, and photographed damaged structures. All damage to commercial and personal property was carefully documented. Although there were isolated cases of greater severity, this map shows the general extent of damage resulting from the explosion. Within 1,000 feet, complete destruction. All deaths occurred within this area. 5,000 feet, severe damage to structures. 8,000 feet, considerable damage to most buildings and personal property. Out to 9 miles, wall and framework movement, extensive glass breakage. 14 miles marked the limit of damage to merchandise, furniture, and personal property. 25 to 35 miles, broken windows and plaster damage. Even the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco submitted a damage claim, one of 10,000 processed by the Navy following the explosion. Damage totaled nearly $13 million to government and civilian property. Meantime, the Court of Inquiry was collecting testimony and exhibits. Experts in all fields were called in to study the area. The cause of the explosion could not be fixed with certainty, but it was suspected that a depth charge was accidentally detonated. With the publication of the court's findings, World War II's biggest domestic explosion became history. But Port Chicago was of more than historical interest to the government. Investigation into the disaster resulted in the most detailed and accurate data ever assembled on effects of a large explosion. As World War II ended, this information became the basis of a far-reaching scientific study by the Armed Services Explosives Safety Board. The board sought to determine the damage which might be expected if a similar explosion were to occur at other military installations. Port Chicago served only as the nucleus of this intensive study. Other large explosions provided additional data. Halifax, 1917, caused by the explosion of more than 5 million pounds of explosives aboard a French ship in the harbor. The city of Halifax was razed. 2,000 people died. Also studied were other World War II accidents involving large quantities of explosives. The effort was to establish scientifically the distances at which ammunition piers and loading wharfs must be located in relation to inhabited buildings. Distances sufficient to ensure that an explosion would not become another catastrophe. While these studies continued, the uneasy years of peace had leveled new responsibilities on the depot. In 1950, Korea, a limited war, demanding conventional weapons of all kinds. Bombs, shells, rockets, again arrived by the trainload. Nearly 3/4 of all ammunition shipped from West Coast ports in support of the United Nations effort was outloaded through this vital depot. By the end of hostilities in Korea, the long-range study of the Armed Forces Explosive Safety Board had been completed, and criteria for the location of pier and wharf facilities had been established for all ammunition depots under the Department of Defense. It was now possible to determine the probable effects of an accidental explosion and establish hazard or buffer zones around such facilities to prevent extensive property damage and loss of life. Operations at the Naval Magazine, Port Chicago, were analyzed to determine the extent of the necessary safety zone. 9 Navy ammunition ships service the Pacific Fleet. Usually 3 and occasionally 5 of these AEs are tied up at the Port Chicago piers at one time. Since each ammunition ship can carry 5,000 tons of gross cargo, including as much as 4.5 million pounds of high explosives, an emergency situation requiring 2 AEs to be berthed at one pier simultaneously could result in a concentration of 9 million pounds of high explosives. Commercial ships transporting ammunition for the Army, Air Force, and military assistance programs can carry 10,000 short tons of gross cargo and from 4 to 9 million pounds of high explosives. Limited or general war in the Pacific could overnight level requirements that would make it essential to use the piers to their maximum capability of 9 million pounds each. To meet the danger of an accidental detonation of 9 million pounds of high explosives, application of the Department of Defense safety criteria required that an uninhabited buffer zone of 2 miles be established around the depot piers, and that all land within this area be acquired by the government. The impact of acquiring this safety zone on neighboring communities was given serious consideration by the Navy Department and the Congress. In 1956, the firm of Arthur D. Little Incorporated was retained to study the possible relocation of Port Chicago facilities. This study surveyed 37 alternate sites along the West Coast and determined that 5 would meet the military and engineering criteria. However, the cost estimates for developing these sites ranged from $40 million to $147 million. As a result of this study, the Secretary of the Navy's report to the Armed Services Committees of Congress recommended retention of the Naval Magazine, Port Chicago, at its present location, and the acquisition of all land and properties within the 2-mile radius of the piers, except the General Chemical Plant and the Western States Chemical Company plant. New commitments in the Pacific continued to put greater demands on the depot. New weapons had been developed. Missiles had been added to the inventory of ordnance items processed at the depot. New facilities, such as this X-ray machine for inspecting larger weapons, were installed to keep pace with new developments. While depot facilities were expanding to accomplish new missions, neighboring communities were also growing. In 1940, the population of Contra Costa County was about 100,000. By 1955, this number had doubled and has since doubled again.